The Geiger counter in my hand clicked like machine gun fire, its digital display climbing past numbers that should have been impossible inside the containment facility. I pressed my back against the concrete wall of Reactor Bay 7, watching the needle dance into the red zone, 750 roentgens per hour and rising fast. At this rate, I'd absorb a lethal dose in minutes. My name is Tobias Mitchell, and I've been a nuclear engineer at Millbrook Containment Facility for 12 years. I know every sound this place makes, every vibration in the cooling pipes, every hum from the reactor cores. What I was hearing now, a deep, thrumming resonance that seemed to come from the earth itself, was wrong. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. Steam hissed from pipes that should have been sealed, and the metallic taste of irradiated air coated my tongue. My skin already tingled with the first warning signs of cellular damage. I had maybe 10 minutes before the dose became unsurvivable. I should have been running. Every protocol, every drill, every safety manual screamed at me to evacuate immediately. But Beth's wedding ring was still in my locker in the control room, and I couldn't abandon it. Couldn't abandon her. Not like this. The control room was a maze of blinking warning lights when I reached it. Every screen showed critical failures, coolant pressure dropping, containment temperature spiking, automated systems going offline one by one. But it was the radiation monitoring station that made my blood freeze. External sensors were registering contamination levels spreading beyond the facility perimeter. The wind was carrying it southeast toward Millbrook Township, toward the elementary school where Beth taught 3rd grade, toward the house where she'd be grading papers and wondering why I was running late. I fumbled with my locker combination, hands shaking as the Geiger counter's clicking intensified. The thin gold band caught the emergency lighting as I slipped it into my pocket. 23 years of marriage, reduced to a piece of metal I might never get to return. Tobias, the voice crackled through my radio. Uriah, my younger brother, calling from the communications center. Where the hell are you? We've got a level 7 event in progress. Level 7, the highest rating on the International Nuclear Event Scale. Chernobyl was a level 7. I keyed the radio with trembling fingers. I'm in the control room. What's your status? Bad and getting worse. I'm reading massive system failures across all networks. Someone's trying to jam our emergency broadcasts, but I've got backup channels running. His voice was tight with controlled panic. Tobias, the automated evacuation alert failed. The townships don't know what's coming. Through the reinforced window, I could see the reactor building's concrete shell beginning to crack. Wisps of radioactive steam escaped through the fissures, glowing with an eerie blue-green light that made my eyes burn. The facility's main klaxon was wailing, but beyond the perimeter, I could see the lights of Millbrook Township twinkling in the distance, oblivious to the death cloud drifting their way on a 15-mile-per-hour wind. I had a choice to make: follow protocol and evacuate immediately, or stay long enough to find out what caused this catastrophic failure. The radiation was already cooking my insides, but if this was sabotage, if someone had deliberately triggered this nightmare, I might be the only one who could prove it. The Geiger counter clicked faster, its digital readout climbing past 1,000 roentgens per hour. At this rate, I had maybe 5 minutes before the exposure became unsurvivable. But Beth's ring felt warm in my pocket, and I could picture her face, trusting me to come home safe like I had for 12 years. I looked at the radiation monitoring displays one more time. The contamination plume was spreading faster than the computer models predicted, following wind patterns that would take it directly over the evacuation routes. Someone needed to warn them. Someone needed to find out why our safety systems had failed so completely. I grabbed the emergency protocols manual and started cross-referencing the failure cascade. Every system that had gone offline, every sensor that had malfunctioned, every backup that had mysteriously failed, it formed a pattern. Too precise to be an accident, too coordinated to be a coincidence. The radio crackled again. Tobias, I'm getting reports of suspicious activity in the security sector. Weston's team was supposed to be running standard patrols, but they've gone dark. Something's not right. Weston, head of facility security, 10-year veteran, always by the book. If his team had gone silent during a level 7 event, it could only mean one thing. I made my choice. Instead of running for the exit, I headed deeper into the facility, toward the security checkpoint where the answers might be waiting. The Geiger counter screamed its metallic protest, but I kept moving. Beth's ring burned like a coal in my pocket, and I promised myself I'd find a way to get it back to her. Even if it killed me, even if it already had. The hallway ahead was filling with radioactive steam, and I could hear something else now, voices, arguing in harsh whispers. Someone was still in the facility, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And if they were responsible for this disaster, I was going to make sure they faced the consequences. I checked my dosimeter one last time. 1,200 Roentgens and climbing. I was already dead. My body just didn't know it yet. But the dead could still serve justice. The steam parted like a curtain as I stepped forward into the contaminated darkness, and the voices grew clearer. They were talking about cleanup, about covering tracks, about making sure no one would ever know what really happened in Reactor Bay 7. They were wrong about that last part. Dead wrong. The voices in the security corridor belonged to dead men walking. They just didn't know it yet. I pressed against the concrete wall, my Geiger counter wrapped in my jacket to muffle its frantic clicking. Through the haze of radioactive steam, I could make out 3 figures in full hazmat suits clustered around an open maintenance panel, their yellow suits glowing under the emergency lighting. "Told you to disable the backup communications array first," one of them was saying, his voice muffled by the respirator. "Now we've got that Mitchell kid broadcasting on emergency frequencies." Mitchell kid. They meant Uriah. Despite the radiation cooking my cells from the inside out, ice ran through my veins. "Relax," another voice replied, gravelly, authoritative, unmistakably Weston. "The primary transmission towers are slag." He's shouting into dead air. He gestured toward a tablet showing facility schematics. "Besides, by the time anyone pieces together what happened here, we'll be in non-extradition territory." I backed away carefully, each step measured to avoid the chunks of concrete and twisted metal that had begun falling from the ceiling. The radiation levels were climbing exponentially. My dosimeter read 1,800 Roentgens per hour. At this rate, I had maybe 3 minutes before my nervous system started shutting down completely. My vision was already starting to blur at the edges, and the metallic taste coating my tongue was getting stronger. But I'd heard enough. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage with a body count in the thousands. My radio crackled softly against my chest. "Tobias, where are you? I've got partial communications restored, but I need your status." Uriah's voice carried the controlled tension of someone holding panic at bay through sheer professionalism. He'd always been the steady one, the one who could function when everything went to hell. I keyed the radio, keeping my voice to a barely audible whisper. "I'm in the security sector. Weston's team, they're involved." This was deliberate. Static filled the channel for several heartbeats, then Uriah's voice returned, tight with disbelief. "That's impossible. Weston's been here longer than both of us. His granddaughter goes to Beth's school." I know what I heard. I was already moving, following the emergency exit signs through corridors that were rapidly becoming uninhabitable. The radiation was so intense now that I could feel it as a physical presence, like standing too close to a furnace. They disabled the backup communications. They're trying to contain information, not radiation. The emergency bunker access required both keycard and biometric authorization. My hands were shaking so badly from radiation exposure that I could barely swipe the card, but the scanner finally accepted my palm print after 3 tries. The massive door ground open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a concrete corridor that stretched into blessed darkness. Behind me, I could hear Weston's team moving through the facility, their voices echoing off the walls as they coordinated their search. They were hunting for something, or someone. Probably me. The tunnel was mercifully cooler, its independent air recycling system still functional. My Geiger counters clicking slowed to a more manageable rhythm as I put distance between myself and the main facility. But I could still taste metal, still feel the burn of cellular damage spreading through my body like acid in my veins. The emergency bunker's blast doors were already sealed when I reached them, but the intercom system was active. "Tobias?" Uriah's voice crackled through the speaker. "Thank God. I've got you on the security cameras. You look like you're about to collapse." "I feel worse," I admitted, pressing my palm against the biometric scanner. The world was starting to spin, and I had to brace myself against the wall to keep from falling. "Let me in. We need to talk." The blast doors cycled open, revealing a sterile chamber lined with monitoring equipment and emergency supplies. Uriah was hunched over a communications console, his fingers flying across multiple keyboards while sweat beaded on his forehead. Banks of screens showed radiation readings, weather patterns, and emergency response protocols. All of it painted the same picture, a disaster spiraling beyond any hope of containment. "How bad is it?" I asked, collapsing into a chair that felt like it was made of lead. My vision was tunneling, and I had to grip the armrests to keep from sliding to the floor. Catastrophic. Uriah didn't look up from his screens. The contamination plume is tracking southeast at 18 miles per hour. Current projections show it hitting Millbrook Township in 43 minutes. He paused, his hands stilling on the keyboard. Tobias, the primary evacuation routes follow Highway 9. That puts them directly in the path of the fallout cloud. I closed my eyes, trying to process the magnitude of what we were facing. Millbrook Township had a population of 8,000 people. The elementary school where Beth taught had 600 students. If they followed the standard evacuation procedures, they'd be driving directly into a radioactive death trap. What about the backup communication systems? I asked, forcing the words out through lips that felt like they were made of sandpaper. Can we reach them? That's the problem. Uriah pulled up a diagnostic screen showing the facility's entire communications network. Nearly every system was marked with red failure indicators. Primary towers are down. Backup arrays are offline. Someone knew exactly which systems to target to maximize the communication blackout. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a coordinated attack designed to maximize casualties while ensuring no one could warn the victims. But why? What could possibly motivate someone to orchestrate this kind of mass murder? There's something else, Uriah continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. I've been monitoring the security feeds. Weston's team isn't trying to evacuate. They're moving toward the server rooms, carrying what looks like industrial-grade data destruction equipment. A cover-up. They were trying to erase evidence of something, and they were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives to do it. My hands clenched into fists, and I felt Beth's wedding ring press against my palm through my pocket. I forced myself to stand, fighting through the radiation sickness that was making my vision blur and my stomach churn. We need to stop them, and we need to get a warning out to the township before it's too late. With what? Uriah gestured at the banks of dead communication equipment. I've got maybe one functional relay station, and its range is limited to about 5 miles. Even if I could reach someone in authority, who's going to believe that this is anything other than a catastrophic accident? The answer came to me with crystalline clarity. Violet Chin. She's the emergency coordinator for the county. If anyone can organize a proper evacuation and has the authority to override standard protocols, it's her. Uriah's fingers were already moving across the keyboard, trying to establish contact with the county emergency management office. I'm getting massive interference on all channels. Someone's actively jamming our transmissions with military-grade equipment. Through the bunker's reinforced windows, I could see the reactor building's containment dome glowing like a malevolent star. The concrete shell was developing hairline cracks that spread like lightning across its surface, and each crack released more radioactive steam into the atmosphere. We had maybe 18 minutes before the structure failed completely, and when it did, the radiation release would dwarf anything we'd seen so far. Then we used the hard line, I said, stumbling toward an emergency communication panel I'd hoped never to touch. The direct line to county emergency services. It's a buried fiber optic cable, hardened against electromagnetic interference and physical damage. I lifted the red phone with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely grip it. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. County Emergency Management, this is Violet Chin. Violet, this is Tobias Mitchell at Millbrook Containment Facility. We have a Level 7 nuclear event in progress, and the standard evacuation routes are compromised. You need to redirect all civilian traffic immediately. The silence stretched for several seconds. Then, Tobias, we're not showing any alerts from your facility. Our automated monitoring systems indicate normal operations across all nuclear facilities in the region. That's because our monitoring systems have been sabotaged, I said, watching Uriah work frantically at his console. Someone deliberately triggered this event and disabled our warning systems. The contamination plume is tracking directly toward the evacuation routes on Highway 9. That's... Her voice carried the weight of someone trying to process an impossible scenario. That's impossible. A Level 7 event would trigger automatic alerts across the entire emergency network. I'm not seeing anything on our boards. I looked at the radiation readings on Uriah's screens, at the weather data showing wind patterns that would carry death across 3 counties. Violet, I need you to trust me. I've got 15 years of experience in nuclear safety, and I'm telling you that in 32 minutes, Everyone following Highway 9 is going to drive directly into a radioactive cloud that will kill them within hours. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear the sound of computer keyboards clicking in the background, the murmur of voices as she consulted with her staff. Finally, send me the data. All of it. Radiation readings, weather patterns, projected fallout patterns. I'll need concrete proof before I can authorize a deviation from federal emergency protocols. Uriah looked up from his console, his face pale with more than just the harsh lighting. The main server connection is completely compromised. I can't transmit anything through normal channels. They've isolated us. I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my probably very short life. Violet, I can't send you the data, but I can give you my word as a nuclear engineer and as a man who's never lied to you that if you don't redirect those evacuees, thousands of people are going to die in the next 30 minutes. Tobias, my wife is in that school, I said, cutting her off. The words came out raw, desperate. Beth Mitchell, third-grade teacher at Millbrook Elementary. She's probably right now helping organize the evacuation, trusting that the authorities know what they're doing. If I thought there was any chance this was a false alarm, do you think I'd be risking her life by asking you to deviate from protocol? The silence stretched longer this time, and I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Finally, what do you need me to do? Relief flooded through me so powerfully that I nearly collapsed. Redirect all evacuation traffic to Route 15 North. Set up roadblocks on Highway 9, and don't let anyone through, no matter what they say. And Violet, get them moving fast. We're running out of time. Consider it done, she replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd made hard decisions before. Tobias, what's your current status? Are you and Uriah safe? I looked at my brother, hunched over his console, surrounded by the instruments that were measuring our slow death. We're alive. That's about all I can say. The line went dead. I sank back into the chair, exhaustion washing over me like a tide. My Geiger counter was clicking again, faster now. The radiation was following us, even into the bunker. Tobias, Uriah said quietly, I'm reading massive structural failures in the reactor building. The containment shell is about to collapse. Through the reinforced windows, I could see cracks spreading across the concrete dome like spider webs. When it finally gave way, the radiation release would dwarf anything we'd seen so far. How long? I asked. 10 minutes. Maybe less. 10 minutes to figure out who had done this and why. 10 minutes to find evidence that would survive the disaster. 10 minutes to ensure that justice would be served even if we didn't live to see it. I stood up, fighting through the nausea and disorientation. Then we better get moving. Those server rooms won't search themselves. The emergency bunker's blast doors cycled open, and we stepped back into the contaminated hell that had once been our workplace. The Geiger counter resumed its frantic clicking, but I barely heard it anymore. We had work to do. The server room's reinforced door hung open like a wound, emergency lighting casting hellish shadows across banks of destroyed equipment. Smoke rose from melted circuit boards and shattered hard drives, the acrid smell of burned plastic mixing with the metallic tang of radiation that coated my throat like acid. My Geiger counter clicked steadily, 340 roentgens per hour, enough to cause severe radiation poisoning within minutes. Jesus Christ, Uriah whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. This isn't random damage. Someone went through here with military-grade thermite charges, targeting specific systems. I knelt beside a destroyed server rack, running my fingers over the precise burn patterns that had melted through steel like butter. Each cut was surgical, designed to destroy data without damaging the surrounding infrastructure. This was the work of someone who understood the facility's information systems better than I did. They knew exactly which servers handled the safety monitoring data. 20 years of maintenance records, incident reports, safety violations, all gone. Not all of it. The voice came from behind us, calm and measured. I spun around to find Weston standing in the doorway, his radiation suit pristine despite the chaos surrounding us. But his hands were empty, his posture that of a man carrying an unbearable weight rather than preparing for violence. Easy, Mitchell, he said, raising his hands slowly. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to confess. Confess? The word came out like a snarl. My hands clenched into fists, and I could feel Beth's wedding ring pressing against my palm through my pocket. You sabotaged the reactor. You murdered thousands of people. What's to confess? Weston's face crumpled behind his visor, and I saw something I'd never seen in 15 years of working with him. genuine remorse. I killed them, yes, but not intentionally. God help me, this was supposed to be a contained incident. A small radiation leak that would force an evacuation and give us time to destroy the evidence. What evidence? Uriah demanded, his normally steady voice carrying an edge of rage that made my blood run cold. What could possibly be worth this? Cascadia Mining Corporation, Weston said, the words falling like stones into still water. They've been dumping radioactive waste into the reactor's cooling systems for 18 months. Low-level contamination, supposedly within safety parameters. But the cumulative effect. He gestured at the destruction around us with hands that shook like autumn leaves. It destabilized the entire containment system. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity, like puzzle pieces forming a picture of hell. The cooling system anomalies. The pressure fluctuations we've been reporting for months. Management kept saying it was within acceptable parameters. Because management was getting paid to say that, Weston replied, his voice barely above a whisper. $15,000 per month, per person, to look the other way. The reactor was never designed to handle that kind of contamination load. We all knew it was a matter of time before something catastrophic happened. So you decided to trigger it yourself? The disgust in my voice was so thick I could taste it. You thought a controlled disaster would be better than an uncontrolled one. I thought we could contain it, Weston said, his voice breaking like glass. The plan was to trigger a small leak in the secondary cooling system, force an evacuation, and use the chaos to destroy the evidence of Cascadia's dumping. By the time federal investigators arrived, it would look like a simple equipment failure. No one would die. Instead, you destabilized the entire reactor core, Uriah said flatly, his words carrying the weight of absolute judgment. The contamination you were trying to hide became the catalyst for complete system failure. Weston nodded, unable to meet our eyes. The thermite charges were supposed to disable the secondary cooling pumps. Clean, surgical cuts that would drain the coolant gradually. But the contamination had corroded the primary containment seals. When the secondary system failed, it triggered a cascade failure that breached the core itself. Through the destroyed server room's windows, I could see the reactor building's containment dome. The cracks were spreading faster now, spiderwebbing across the concrete surface like a slow-motion explosion. Each new fracture released more radioactive steam into the atmosphere, and the wind was carrying it directly toward the evacuation routes where my wife was traveling. The people on Highway 9, I said, my voice hoarse with radiation exposure and terror. They're driving straight into a death trap. I know, Weston whispered. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies. The evacuation buses left Millbrook Elementary 18 minutes ago. They're following standard protocols, taking the shortest route to the designated safety zones. Beth's school. My wife was on one of those buses, probably sitting in the back with her students, reading them a story to keep them calm. She had no idea she was driving toward a radioactive cloud that would strip the skin from her bones. We warned them, I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. Violet Chin is redirecting the evacuation traffic. She'll get them to safety. Maybe, Weston replied. But Cascadia has people in the county emergency management office too. If they can delay or countermand the redirect order. They won't, Uriah interrupted, his fingers flying across a tablet he'd pulled from his equipment bag. Because we're going to make sure everyone knows exactly what happened here. He was connecting to the facility's emergency broadcast system, the hardened network designed to function even during catastrophic failures. The broadcast system is dead, Weston said. We made sure of that. You made sure the automated systems were dead, Uriah corrected. But the manual override is still functional. It's a completely separate system, buried 60 feet underground and hardened against electromagnetic interference. I watched my brother work, his hands steady despite the radiation sickness that was eating us alive from the inside out. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his fingers moved with the precision of a master craftsman. Even in crisis, he remained the careful technician, the one who could find solutions when everything else failed. What are you doing? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Broadcasting everything, he replied without looking up. Radiation readings, weather patterns, evacuation routes, and most importantly, he pulled out a digital recorder, its red light blinking like a mechanical heartbeat. A full confession from our friend here about Cascadia's illegal dumping and the sabotage that turned it into a massacre. Weston's face went pale behind his visor. You can't. They'll kill my family. Cascadia has people everywhere, security contractors, federal agents, local police. If they find out I talked, then you better hope we get this story out before they can stop us, I said, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Because right now, you're the only person who can prove this wasn't just a catastrophic accident. The moral dilemma crystallized in that moment like ice forming on a window. Weston was a murderer, a man whose greed and cowardice had triggered a disaster that would kill thousands. But he was also the only witness who could expose the corporate conspiracy that had made the disaster possible. Without his testimony, Cascadia would escape justice, free to contaminate other facilities and endanger other communities. Tell them about the waste shipments, I said, activating the recorder. Tell them about the bribes, the falsified safety reports, the deliberate contamination of the cooling systems. Tell them everything. Weston stared at the device for several seconds, his internal struggle visible in every line of his face. Finally, he began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of confession. My name is Weston Charles Hayes, Senior Security Supervisor at Millbrook Containment Facility. For the past 18 months, I have been complicit in a criminal conspiracy involving the illegal disposal of radioactive waste and the systematic compromise of nuclear safety protocols. His confession poured out in a torrent of dates, names, and dollar amounts that painted a picture of corruption so extensive it took my breath away. Cascadia Mining Corporation had been paying facility personnel to allow contaminated material into the reactor's cooling systems. The contamination had been disguised as routine maintenance additives, its true nature hidden by falsified safety reports and corrupted monitoring systems. The bribes weren't just for disposal, Weston continued, his voice gaining strength as he unburdened himself. They were paying us to hide the evidence of contamination that had already occurred. The reactor core has been slowly degrading for months, weakened by radioactive elements that were never meant to be there. How many people knew? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 12 facility personnel, including 3 engineers, 2 safety inspectors, and 6 security officers. At the corporate level, at least 20 Cascadia executives were directly involved in planning and funding the operation. And the sabotage? Was my idea, Weston admitted, the words coming out like confessions torn from his soul. I thought we could trigger a small incident that would force facility closure and give us time to destroy the evidence. Instead, the contamination I was trying to hide became the catalyst for complete system failure. Uriah looked up from his tablet, his face grim. Broadcasting in 30 seconds. This is going out on every emergency frequency in the region, plus backup feeds to news organizations and federal agencies. Through the windows, I could see the reactor building's containment dome beginning to buckle. The cracks were spreading faster now, and I could hear the groan of stressed concrete echoing across the facility like the death rattle of a giant beast. When it finally collapsed, the radiation release would be visible from space. Broadcasting now, Uriah announced. The emergency broadcast system activated with a harsh electronic tone, followed by Uriah's voice. This is emergency alert system test. This is not a test. A level 7 nuclear event is in progress at Millbrook Containment Facility. All personnel in the affected area should immediately. The lights went out. Emergency power kicked in a second later, but the broadcast equipment remained dead. Someone had cut the power to the entire emergency communications network, leaving us trapped in the bunker with no way to warn the outside world. Cascadia's people, Weston said grimly. They were monitoring our communications. They know we're here. Then we go to them, I said, checking my radiation dosimeter. The numbers were climbing again, but I still had maybe an hour before the exposure became immediately fatal. We find another way to get the message out. The backup transmitter, Uriah said suddenly. In the original facility construction, they installed a secondary broadcast system in the cooling tower structure. It's completely separate from the main network, designed to function even if the primary facility was destroyed. That's a quarter-mile walk through the most contaminated area of the facility, I pointed out. The radiation levels there will kill us in minutes. Then we better move fast, Uriah replied, shouldering his equipment bag. Because if we don't get this story out, Cascadia will cover up everything. They'll blame the disaster on equipment failure, pay compensation to the families, and continue dumping waste at other facilities. Weston stood up slowly, his face set with grim determination. I'm coming with you. I caused this. I should be the one to fix it. You'll never make it, I said. The radiation exposure will kill you before we reach the cooling tower. Then I'll die trying to save the people I've already killed, he replied. It's the least I can do. The emergency bunker's blast doors cycled open, and we stepped back into the contaminated hellscape that had once been our workplace. The Geiger counter resumed its frantic clicking, but I barely heard it anymore. We had work to do, and very little time to do it. The cooling tower loomed ahead of us through the radioactive haze, its concrete bulk offering the promise of salvation, if we could reach it alive. Behind us, the reactor building's containment dome continued its slow collapse, each crack releasing more death into the atmosphere. But somewhere out there, evacuation buses were changing course, following new routes that would take them away from the contamination plume. Violet Chin had kept her word, and that gave me hope. The truth would come out. The guilty would be held accountable, even if we didn't live to see it. The cooling tower's shadow fell across us like a death shroud as we stumbled through the radioactive wasteland that had once been the facility's maintenance yard. My dosimeter read 820 roentgens per hour, a level that would cook us from the inside out within 15 minutes. The metallic taste in my mouth had become overwhelming, coating my tongue with the flavor of copper pennies and impending death. "Tobias, wait." Uriah's voice cracked like breaking glass. He stopped beside a twisted piece of metal that had once been part of the reactor's cooling system, his legs trembling from radiation sickness. "I need to tell you something." I turned back to find my brother hunched over, his face pale as laboratory paper behind his radiation suit's visor. Blood trickled from his nose, dark drops that looked black in the hellish red light of the emergency flares scattered across the contaminated ground. "The backup transmitter," he said, his words coming in ragged gasps. "It's not just in the cooling tower. It's at the top of the cooling tower, 300 feet up, accessible only by maintenance ladder." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Even if we reached the tower alive, one of us would have to climb through the most contaminated section of the facility to reach the broadcast equipment. In our current condition, with radiation poisoning already ravaging our bodies, it was a death sentence. "How long?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The exposure levels up there?" Uriah checked his tablet, its screen flickering from electromagnetic interference. "Maybe 5 minutes before complete system failure. 10 if you're lucky." Behind us, Weston was falling further behind, his confession having taken the last of his strength. The man who had triggered this disaster was now paying the price for his cowardice, his body betraying him as the radiation stripped away his cellular structure one atom at a time. "We should leave him," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "He's dead weight, and we're running out of time." "No." Uriah's voice carried a finality that brooked no argument. "He's the only witness who can prove Cascadia's guilt. Without him, they'll cover this up and do it again at another facility." The moral mathematics of survival were brutal in their simplicity. Every second we spent helping Weston was a second less we had to reach the transmitter. But every second we abandoned him was another family that would suffer when Cascadia repeated this atrocity somewhere else. A new sound cut through the air, the deep, mechanical groan of stressed concrete. I looked back toward the reactor building in time to see the containment dome's northeastern wall buckle inward, a massive crack splitting the structure from foundation to apex. Radioactive steam poured through the breach like the breath of a dying god, and the wind carried it directly toward the evacuation routes. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, pulling out my emergency radio. "Violet, this is Tobias. The dome just breached. You need to redirect the evacuation traffic immediately." Static answered me, followed by Violet's voice, tight with controlled panic. "Tobias, thank God. We've got a problem. Cascadia's people are here at the emergency command center. They're claiming authority over the evacuation and countermanding our route changes." "What do you mean claiming authority?" "Federal Emergency Response Contract," she replied, her words barely audible over the radio interference. "They're saying the Department of Energy has designated them as the primary response contractor for nuclear incidents. They've got documentation, federal credentials, the whole package." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Cascadia hadn't just been paying facility personnel to hide their illegal dumping. They'd been positioning themselves to control the response when their crimes were inevitably discovered. By securing federal contracts for emergency response, they could direct the investigation, control the narrative, and eliminate any evidence that might incriminate them. "They're sending the buses back to the original evacuation routes," Violet continued. "The ones that lead directly through the contamination plume. I've been overruled, Tobias. I can't stop them." Beth's face flashed in my mind, her smile as she left for work that morning, her promise to read stories to her students to keep them calm during the evacuation. She was sitting in one of those buses right now, trusting that the authorities would keep her safe, having no idea that those same authorities were leading her to her death. How long before the first bus reaches the contamination zone? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. 12 minutes, Violet replied. Maybe 15 if they hit traffic. 8 minutes. I looked up at the cooling tower, its concrete bulk disappearing into the radioactive haze above us. 300 feet of contaminated air and twisted metal, with a climb that would kill whoever attempted it. But if we didn't make that climb, Beth would die. They all would die, and Cascadia would escape justice. Uriah, I said, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. I need you to stay here with Weston. Get him to the base of the tower and keep him alive. I'm going up alone. Like hell you are, my brother replied, his voice finding strength despite the radiation poisoning. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. One of us has to survive to tell the story, I said, pulling Beth's wedding ring from my pocket. The gold band caught the hellish light of the emergency flares, a reminder of everything I was fighting to save. If I don't make it down, you get Weston to safety and make sure his confession reaches the right people. And if you do make it down? Uriah asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. Then we've saved a few thousand lives, I replied. And maybe that's enough. The cooling tower's access ladder was a rusty vertical scar running up the concrete wall, its rungs slick with condensation and radioactive fallout. My Geiger counter went insane as I approached the base, its clicking becoming a continuous shriek that I finally switched off to preserve my sanity. The radiation levels were so high that measuring them had become pointless. I was already dead, just waiting for my body to realize it. Tobias. Weston's voice was barely a whisper, his confession having cost him the last of his strength. Before you go up there, you need to know something else. I knelt beside him, my hazmat suit crinkling in the radioactive wind. What? This isn't the only facility, he said, his words coming in ragged gasps. Cascadia has contracts with 17 nuclear installations across the country. They've been dumping contaminated material at all of them, using the same bribery network, the same falsified safety reports. The implications were staggering. If Cascadia had been systematically contaminating nuclear facilities across the country, this disaster wasn't an isolated incident. It was a preview of what was coming. Other reactors, other communities, other families like Beth's students, all of them at risk from corporate greed and regulatory capture. The documentation is in my apartment, Weston continued. Apartment 4B, Riverside Complex in Millbrook, under the floorboards beneath the kitchen sink. Financial records, communication logs, facility blueprints, everything needed to prove the conspiracy. Why are you telling me this? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Because I'm not going to live to see justice done, he replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. But maybe you can make sure it happens anyway. I looked up at the cooling tower ladder, its rungs disappearing into the radioactive haze above. 300 feet of contaminated air and twisted metal, with exposure levels that would kill me before I reached the top. But at the summit was a transmitter powerful enough to reach every emergency frequency in the region, and the federal agencies that might actually act on Weston's evidence. Take care of my brother, I said, beginning my climb. The first 100 feet were manageable, despite the radiation sickness that was eating away at my coordination. The ladder was solid, the rungs thick enough to support my weight even as my hands began to shake from cellular damage. But as I climbed higher, the contamination levels increased exponentially, and my body began to shut down. At 200 feet, I started vomiting blood, the red drops falling like rain toward the ground below. My vision blurred, and I could feel my nervous system beginning to fail as the radiation stripped away the myelin sheaths that protected my nerve fibers. Every movement became an act of will, every breath a conscious decision to continue living. At 250 feet, I looked down to see Uriah and Weston at the base of the tower, two tiny figures in a landscape of concrete and steel. My brother was kneeling beside the former security supervisor, probably trying to keep him conscious long enough to repeat his confession. They looked impossibly small from this height, two men fighting against forces beyond their comprehension. Almost there, I whispered to myself, though my voice was lost in the wind that carried radioactive particles like snow. Just a little further. The transmitter housing was a squat concrete structure bolted to the tower's rim, its antenna array reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers. The access panel was locked, but my engineering training had included basic electrical work, and I managed to bypass the security system with tools from my equipment belt. Inside the housing, banks of equipment hummed with electric power, their LED displays casting rainbow patterns across the walls. The transmission controls were surprisingly simple, a series of switches and dials that would have looked at home in a 1950s radio station. But they were functional, and that was all that mattered. I connected Uriah's digital recorder to the system, my fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone who had practiced this procedure 1,000 times. The confession began to play, Weston's voice filling the small space with the weight of truth. My name is Weston Charles Hayes, Senior Security Supervisor at Millbrook Containment Facility. For the past 18 months, I have been complicit in a criminal conspiracy involving the illegal disposal of radioactive waste. The transmission went out on every emergency frequency in the region, carried by radio waves that would reach federal agencies, news organizations, and emergency responders across the country. For the first time in 18 months, the truth about Cascadia's crimes was being broadcast to the world. But as I listened to the confession, I realized that the truth alone wouldn't be enough. Cascadia had money, lawyers, political connections, and federal contracts that would allow them to weather this storm. They would claim that Weston was a rogue employee, that the contamination was his fault alone, that they were victims of his sabotage rather than co-conspirators in his crimes. I needed more than a confession. I needed evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. The transmitter's emergency override system was designed to take control of all local broadcast networks during catastrophic events, replacing regular programming with emergency information. It was a nuclear option in the truest sense, a way to reach every television, radio, and internet connection in the region with a single transmission. I activated the override, my fingers moving across the controls with practiced precision. Every screen in the tri-state area would now display the same message, carried by satellite uplinks and fiber optic cables to millions of viewers. Emergency broadcast system activation. This is not a test. A Level 7 nuclear event is in progress at Millbrook Containment Facility. Corporate sabotage by Cascadia Mining Corporation has resulted in uncontainable radiation release. Federal response compromised. Seek immediate shelter. The message would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Cascadia could claim that Weston was lying, but they couldn't claim that the radiation readings were fabricated. They could dismiss his confession as the ravings of a guilty man, but they couldn't dismiss the evidence of their own corporate involvement in federal emergency response. As I watched the transmission counters tick upward, indicating successful broadcast to dozens of networks, I felt a savage satisfaction. Cascadia had spent millions of dollars in 18 months building their conspiracy, but it was crumbling in real time as the truth spread across the airwaves. My radio crackled to life, Violet's voice cutting through the static. Tobias, the evacuation buses are turning around. Whatever you're broadcasting, it's working. People are demanding answers, and Cascadia's people are losing control of the situation. Good, I replied, though my voice was barely a whisper. The radiation exposure was shutting down my vocal cords, making speech increasingly difficult. Make sure Weston gets to safety. He has more evidence hidden in his apartment. What about you? Violet asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I looked down at my hands, watching the skin begin to blister and peel from radiation exposure. My dosimeter had maxed out at 999 roentgens per hour, its digital display flashing red warnings that I couldn't read through my failing eyesight. The cellular damage was irreversible, and my body was beginning to shut down one system at a time. I'm not coming down, I said, the words carrying the weight of absolute finality. But the truth is out there now. That has to be enough. The last thing I saw before my vision failed completely was the reactor building's containment dome finally collapsing in on itself, its concrete walls crumbling like a house of cards. The radioactive steam rose toward the sky in a mushroom cloud that would be visible for miles, a monument to corporate greed and regulatory failure. But the evacuation buses were safe, following new routes that would take them away from the contamination plume. Beth was safe, her students were safe, and the truth about Cascadia's crimes was spreading across the country like wildfire. The guilty would be held accountable. The system would be reformed. Other facilities would be protected. Even if I didn't live to see it, it was enough. The transmitter continued broadcasting, its automated systems sending the truth into the world long after I was gone. In the distance, I could hear the sound of helicopters, federal investigators, probably coming to see what was left of Millbrook Containment Facility. They would find Weston's evidence. They would shut down Cascadia's operations. They would prevent this from happening again. That knowledge gave me peace as the darkness closed in around me, carrying me toward whatever waited beyond the radioactive wasteland that had once been my workplace. The truth would survive, even if I didn't. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. The cooling tower's emergency transmitter hummed with lethal energy beneath my radiation-burned fingers, its LED displays casting sickly green light across the cramped housing 300 feet above the dying reactor. My dosimeter had long since maxed out at 999 roentgens per hour, its warning beeps replaced by an ominous silence that meant I was already a walking corpse. The metallic taste of ionizing radiation coated my tongue like copper pennies dissolved in acid, and I could feel my nervous system shutting down one synapse at a time. Below me, the federal convoy had arrived, real investigators this time, not Cascadia's corporate puppets. Through the transmitter housing's reinforced window, I watched hazmat-suited figures racing through the contaminated landscape, their movements urgent and precise. They'd found Uriah and Weston at the tower's base, and I could see my brother pointing upward, probably explaining why his idiot engineer sibling had climbed into the most radioactive zone in North America. The confession was already broadcasting on every emergency frequency in the region, Weston's voice cutting through the static like a blade through silk. My name is Weston Charles Hayes, Senior Security Supervisor at Millbrook Containment Facility. For the past 18 months, I have been complicit in a criminal conspiracy involving the illegal disposal of radioactive waste by Cascadia Mining Corporation. They paid me $47,000 to falsify safety reports and provide access to restricted disposal areas. But as I listened to his recorded words, I realized something that made my dying blood run cold. The confession was damning, but it wasn't enough. Cascadia had money, lawyers, federal contracts, and political connections that would let them weather this storm. They'd claim Weston was a rogue employee, that the contamination was his fault alone, that they were victims rather than architects of this disaster. Corporate lawyers were probably already drafting press releases, preparing damage control strategies, mobilizing their media contacts. They'd survived worse scandals than this. I needed more than a confession. I needed evidence that would destroy them completely. My radio crackled with Violet's voice, the transmission distorted by electromagnetic interference from the failing reactor. Tobias, the evacuation buses are turning around. Whatever you're broadcasting, it's working. But Cascadia's people are claiming the whole thing is a hoax. They're saying Weston is mentally unstable, that the radiation readings are falsified. Their lawyers are already on local news calling this an elaborate suicide hoax by a disgruntled employee. Of course they were. Even as their crimes were being exposed in real time, they were already spinning the narrative, controlling the damage, preparing their legal defense. It was exactly what I'd expected from a company that had spent millions building this conspiracy. "Violet," I replied, my voice barely audible through the vocal cord damage caused by internal radiation burns. "I need you to patch me through to the federal team, priority override, and tell them to ignore anything coming from Cascadia's public relations department. Tobias, you need to get down from there. The medical teams are 18 months too late," I finished. "Just get me that connection." The radio went silent for a moment, then a new voice came through, crisp, professional, urgent. "This is Special Agent Patricia Reeves, Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Are you the individual broadcasting from the cooling tower?" "Senior Nuclear Engineer Tobias Michaelchin," I replied, forcing my damaged vocal cords to work. "I'm transmitting from the emergency broadcast station. Agent Reeves, how much do you know about Cascadia's federal contracts?" A pause. "We're investigating their emergency response authorization, but their documentation appears legitimate. Department of Energy confirms they have primary contractor status for nuclear incidents." The pieces clicked together with horrifying clarity. Cascadia hadn't just been bribing facility personnel. They'd been systematically positioning themselves to control the federal response when their crimes were inevitably discovered. By securing emergency response contracts, they could direct investigations, control evidence, and eliminate witnesses. They'd essentially bought themselves immunity from their own crimes. "Agent Reeves," I said, forcing each word through radiation-damaged vocal cords that felt like they were lined with broken glass. "Cascadia isn't just contaminating facilities. They're controlling the federal response to their own crimes. Check your contractor databases. I guarantee you'll find their fingerprints on every nuclear incident in the past 2 years. They've been playing both sides of the equation. Another pause, longer this time. Then, Jesus Christ. We need to secure that evidence location immediately. Can you maintain the broadcast until we... The words died in her throat as a new alarm cut through the air. The reactor building's final warning. Through the transmitter housing's window, I watched the last of the containment dome collapse, sending a fresh plume of radioactive steam toward the sky. The wind was carrying it away from the evacuation routes, toward the abandoned industrial district where Cascadia had been dumping their waste for months. Even in death, the reactor was exposing their crimes. Agent Reeves, I said, my voice growing weaker as the radiation damage progressed. The reactor's going critical. But that's not the real problem. The real problem is that Cascadia has been systematically compromising nuclear facilities across the country. Weston has documentation proving a 17-facility conspiracy. I could hear her shouting orders in the background, coordinating with other agencies, mobilizing resources. But I also heard something else, the sound of helicopters approaching from the south. More federal agents, probably, or maybe Cascadia's private security, trying to cut the transmission before it could spread further. How long can you maintain the broadcast? Agent Reeves asked. I looked down at my hands, watching the skin blister and peel from radiation exposure. My nervous system was shutting down, my immune system was collapsing, and my organs were beginning to fail. But the transmitter was automated, and I'd rigged it to loop the confession indefinitely. The equipment will broadcast until someone physically destroys it, I replied. But I need to give you something else first. I activated the emergency broadcast override system, the nuclear option that would hijack every television, radio, and internet connection in the region. Within seconds, millions of viewers would see the same message, carried by satellite uplinks and fiber optic cables to every screen in the tri-state area. Emergency broadcast system activation. This is not a test. Cascadia Mining Corporation has systematically contaminated nuclear facilities across the United States. Federal response compromised by corporate conspiracy. Documentation located at 4B Riverside Complex, Millbrook. Secure evidence immediately. The message would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Cascadia could claim that Weston was lying, but they couldn't claim that federal agents were fabricating evidence. They could dismiss his confession as the ravings of a guilty man, but they couldn't dismiss a coordinated federal investigation. Agent Reeves, I said, feeling my strength ebb with each word. I'm uploading Weston's digital files to the emergency broadcast network. Financial records, communication logs, facility blueprints, everything you need to prove the conspiracy. My fingers moved across the controls with mechanical precision, years of training overriding the cellular damage that was killing me. The transmitter's data channels could carry more than just audio. They could transmit documents, images, video files, anything that could be digitized. Weston's confession was just the beginning. The real evidence was in the financial records that showed Cascadia's payments to facility personnel, the communication logs that proved coordination between sites, the facility blueprints that showed exactly where they'd been dumping contaminated material. Upload complete, I managed to whisper. Every news organization in the country should have those files within the hour. The radio went quiet for a moment, then Agent Reeves' voice came through, tight with controlled urgency. Mr. Chun, we have teams moving to secure the evidence locations. But we need you to maintain the broadcast station. Cascadia's people are claiming the whole thing is an elaborate hoax, that the radiation readings are falsified. I tried to laugh, but it came out as a bloody cough. Agent Reeves, I'm currently absorbing about 1,200 Roentgens per hour. That's enough radiation to kill a dozen people. If this is a hoax, then I'm the most dedicated method actor in history. Sir, we have medical teams en route. Don't. The word came out harder than I intended. Don't waste resources on a lost cause. Focus on securing the evidence and shutting down Cascadia's operations. That's what matters now. Through the transmitter housing's window, I could see more vehicles arriving, news trucks, emergency responders, federal agents in hazmat suits. The story was spreading, the truth was getting out, and Cascadia's carefully constructed conspiracy was crumbling in real time. But I could also see something else that made my heart race. A black helicopter approaching from the north, flying low and fast. No federal markings, no emergency lights, just the sleek profile of corporate aviation. Agent Reeves, I said, keying the radio with trembling fingers. You've got incoming. Black helicopter, probably Cascadia security. They're going to try to cut the transmission. We see them, she replied. Federal assets are moving to intercept. The helicopter circled the cooling tower like a mechanical vulture, its rotor wash stirring up radioactive dust from the contaminated landscape below. I could see figures in the cabin, probably mercenaries hired to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. They were 18 months too late for that. I activated the transmitter's final protocol, a dead man's switch that would continue broadcasting even if the equipment was physically destroyed. The system would automatically upload all stored data to every available network, ensuring that the truth would survive even if I didn't. This is Tobias Michael Chun, Senior Nuclear Engineer at Millbrook Containment Facility. I spoke into the microphone, my voice a rasping whisper. I am currently broadcasting from the emergency transmitter atop the facility's cooling tower. The radiation exposure I have received in the past hour is fatal. I will not survive this transmission. I paused, gathering what little strength remained in my failing respiratory system. But the evidence you have heard is true. Cascadia Mining Corporation has been systematically contaminating nuclear facilities across the United States. They have corrupted federal emergency response protocols, bribed facility personnel, and endangered millions of lives in pursuit of profit. The helicopter was closer now, and I could see rappelling equipment being prepared. They were going to try to storm the transmitter housing, probably destroy the equipment, and claim the whole thing was an elaborate suicide hoax. The documentation proving their crimes has been uploaded to every major news network in the country, I continued. Federal agents are securing additional evidence as I speak. The truth will survive, even if I don't. A new voice cut through the radio static. Uriah, his words barely audible over the helicopter's rotor noise. Tobias, federal agents are surrounding the tower. Whatever Cascadia's people are planning, they're not going to get close to you. I looked down to see figures in hazmat suits forming a perimeter around the cooling tower's base. Sniper teams were setting up positions, and I could see the distinctive profiles of federal SWAT vehicles moving through the contaminated landscape. The black helicopter pulled back, its occupants probably realizing that their window of opportunity had closed. They'd gambled that they could eliminate the evidence before federal investigators arrived, but they'd lost. Agent Reeves, I said, my voice barely audible even to myself. The reactor's final containment is failing. You need to expand the evacuation zone to at least 20 miles. The contamination plume is going to be massive. Copy that, she replied. We're coordinating with local emergency management. The evacuation is proceeding smoothly now that we've removed Cascadia's people from the command structure. I felt a savage satisfaction at those words. Cascadia's conspiracy was unraveling, their federal contracts were being revoked, and their crimes were being exposed to the world. They'd spent millions of dollars and 18 months building their network of corruption, but it was crumbling in real time as the truth spread across the airwaves. Agent Reeves, I said, there's something else you need to know. Cascadia didn't just contaminate these facilities. They've been using them as permanent disposal sites for high-level radioactive waste. The contamination isn't just surface level. It goes down hundreds of feet, into the groundwater, into the soil. A pause. Jesus Christ. We're looking at environmental remediation costs in the billions. Try tens of billions, I replied. And that's just for the facilities we know about. If they've been doing this at 17 locations. I didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were staggering. Entire communities poisoned, ecosystems destroyed, generations of families affected by corporate greed and regulatory capture. The microphone slipped from my numb fingers as my nervous system finally began to shut down completely. But the transmitter continued broadcasting, its automated systems sending the truth into the world even as my consciousness started to fade. Through the reinforced window, I could see the federal response spreading across the landscape like antibodies fighting an infection. Hazmat teams were securing evidence, investigators were documenting the contamination, and news helicopters were broadcasting the scene to the world. My radio crackled one final time with Violet's voice. Tobias, the evacuation is complete. Everyone's safe. The buses are clear of the contamination zone, and the emergency shelters are fully stocked. I tried to respond, but my vocal cords had finally given out. Instead, I keyed the radio twice, the old signal Uriah and I had used as kids when we were too far apart to hear each other, but close enough to see the flash of a flashlight. Below me, I could see my brother looking up at the cooling tower, probably understanding that final message. He raised his hand in a gesture that might have been a wave or a salute, then turned back to the federal agents who were taking his statement. The truth would survive. Cascadia's crimes would be exposed, their operations would be shut down, and their executives would spend the rest of their lives in federal prison. The contamination would be cleaned up, the victims would be compensated, and new regulations would prevent this from happening again. It wasn't the ending I'd planned when I woke up that morning, but it was enough. Sometimes that's all you can ask for, to leave the world a little better than you found it, even if the cost is everything you have. The darkness closed in around me as the transmitter continued its automated broadcast, carrying the truth across the country like wildfire. In the distance, I could hear the sound of helicopters, federal investigators, news crews, emergency responders, all racing to document what was left of Millbrook Containment Facility. They would find the evidence. They would shut down the conspiracy. They would prevent this from happening again. And in the end, that knowledge gave me peace as the radiation finally claimed its last victim, carrying me toward whatever waited beyond the radioactive wasteland that had once been my workplace. The truth would survive, even if I didn't. And sometimes that's all you can ask for.